Welcome to the Alibi Club. I've walked through those olive groves more times than I can count, and every time I hear something, a rustle, a whisper. Sometimes it's the wind, other times it's something worse. You see, this case isn't just about a killer. It's about a story that devours the ones who tell it. I thought I was prepared. I had files, photos, transcripts, but Florence has a way of burying truth under cobblestones and wine-stained myths. They called him a monster. But what if the real monster is the silence that let him live for so long? Let me show you what I've found. There's something disturbingly poetic about the first crime scene. It was a warm summer night, 1968. I wasn't born yet. But I've stood at the very edge of that field, by the parked car, just past Via Diogoli, in the outskirts of Florence. The trees were silent when I arrived, almost respectful. That's the thing about this case. It makes you feel like the ghosts are watching you back. The victims were young, Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci. Lovers, yes, but not lovers in peace. The car they sat in became their coffin. Locci was married, you see. Her husband was home with their child, and the man arrested for the crime, her lover at the time, Stefano Mele. He confessed. But even back then, something felt off. I got my hands on the confession, typed, faded, barely legible, and I stared at it again and again, because it read more like a grocery list than a murder confession. Mele claimed he killed them out of jealousy, but not alone. He mentioned others, friends, accomplices. The police didn't chase those leads. They had what they needed, a confession, a body, a suspect. Case closed. But the killings didn't stop. Years passed, but the pattern stayed. Always couples, always in cars, always at night. And each time, the killer left behind something chilling. The woman's body mutilated, violated, sometimes post-mortem. That wasn't just rage, that was ritual. In my notes, I circled the word escalation. The first murder was almost clean, surgical, but the later ones, carnage, controlled chaos, a predator learning his craft. That's when the theory began. What if Mele was never the real killer? What if the Monster of Florence had watched that first murder and learned? I tracked down a retired officer. Let's call him N. He was there early in the investigation. We met at a tiny cafe near Ponte Vecchio. He lit a cigarette before I could ask the first question. Then he said, "We all knew. The real killer was still out there, but you try telling that to men who already closed the file." He handed me a faded photo, not of the crime scene, but of a sketch, a crude, almost childlike drawing of a man's face. No eyes, just black sockets. It had been mailed anonymously to the station in 1974. No return address, no fingerprints, just the caption, "He watches you." I kept that photo. It's in my file now, under the heading Unexplained Evidence. There's a lot of that in this case. You see, the monster wasn't just a man. He was a shadow, a myth that bled into reality. Each murder carried his signature, his hunger, and the police? They chased red herrings, tripped over jurisdictional boundaries, and locked up suspects who turned out to be either too convenient or too dead to argue. But the thing that gets me, the thing that keeps me up at night, is this. Why did he stop? That's the year the murders ended. Maybe he died, maybe he got bored, or maybe, just maybe, he changed tactics, left the forests and fields behind, moved into the cities, found new masks to wear. Waninan, there's a theory I've only ever heard whispered. It wasn't one of the investigators who told me, it was a journalist. A woman who'd spent years chasing the monster and lost friends because of it. she told me. What if the monster wasn't just one man? What if he was a club? A club. The word rattled in my brain like a key in a rusted lock. The idea was unthinkable until it wasn't. What if it wasn't one sadistic killer, but a network? Rituals, symbols, shared pleasure and pain, a coordinated silence that kept the secret safe for decades. I asked her why she never published that theory. She looked at me for a long time and said, "Because when I tried, my editor got a letter, no name, just a drawing, 2 black eyes. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a cold case, it was a warning. Every step I've taken since then has felt watched. Every file I read, every photo I review, it's like something's following me, not someone, something. An idea, maybe. A memory that doesn't belong to me. That's why I started this investigation. Not to solve the case, because I'm not arrogant enough to think I can do what decades of detectives couldn't. No. I started this because I need to understand what kind of darkness turns a city of art, wine, and opera into a hunting ground. Next, I'll walk you through the second killing, 1974. The one that changed everything. The one that proved the monster wasn't done. Because once you hear the full story, you'll start to see him too. The second killing came like an echo, louder than the first, bloodier than expected. It was 1974, 6 years after the supposed resolution of the case. A couple, again, Pasquale Gentlecore and Stefania Pettini. They had driven out to a quiet lover's lane in the woods near Borgo San Lorenzo. It was the kind of spot people go to hide, to feel free. But that night, it turned into a slaughterhouse. By the time the bodies were found, the car door was open, and nature had already started reclaiming the scene. Leaves on the seats, ants on the dashboard, the air thick with decay. The boy had been stabbed, repeatedly. No sign of restraint, no theft, no motive, at least none that made sense. And the girl had been violated, horribly. A vine branch was found in her body. I'm not going to pretend that detail didn't haunt me. I've been in this job long enough to have seen all kinds of evil. But this wasn't just violence, it was performance, deliberate, ceremonial, a message that no one could read. The police did what they always do. They reopened the old case, reluctantly. Their first assumption was predictable, a copycat. Someone inspired by the 1968 killing, maybe a local pervert looking for a thrill. But the details didn't match the profile of an imitator. The killer had precision, confidence, familiarity with the land. He'd watched them long enough to know when to strike and how to vanish. I went to the archive room in Florence, dusty, dim, a basement that smelled like lost years. I pulled the files. Crime scene photos, victim profiles, medical examiner notes. One line stood out in the autopsy. No hesitation marks, no defensive wounds. The attack was swift, final. It wasn't messy, it was surgical. When I traced the timeline, I found something that chilled me. Stefano Mele, the man convicted in 1968, was still in a psychiatric facility when this second murder occurred. He couldn't have done it. So, if Mele was the killer, then who did this? And if he wasn't, why was he locked up at all? I reached out to a former reporter, an old man now, mostly forgotten by the journalism world. He'd covered both cases. When I asked him about the copycat theory, he laughed, dry and bitter. That wasn't a copycat. That was the same hand. But the police, they didn't want to admit they'd caged the wrong man. Too much paperwork, too much shame. He showed me his personal notes, things he'd never published. There, among the scribbles, was something extraordinary. The mention of a mutilation pattern, left to right incisions. always with a blade, never a gun, and always the female victim disfigured far worse than the male. I started to see it then. This wasn't a killer driven by opportunity. This was obsession, a pathology rooted in something deeper, psychosexual rage perhaps. Or, as one profiler later suggested, a desire to unmake the female form. That phrase haunted me. You want to know what made this worse? The police had suspects, several. They even arrested a man briefly, but nothing ever stuck. No physical evidence, no DNA. The killer left behind no fingerprints. He wore gloves, clearly, cleaned up after himself. No murder weapon was ever found, but what he did leave behind was a pattern. Couples, isolated locations, lovers' lanes, knife attacks, the brutal targeting of women, and yet he was invisible. By the time I walked the trail near Borgo San Lorenzo myself, it had changed. The trees were older. A bike path now runs through part of the area, but if you know where to look, you can still find the markers, the flattened grass, the hollowed log, the stone with a scratch mark that doesn't seem like erosion. I sat there for a while, closed my eyes, tried to imagine what he saw. A couple, kissing, windows fogged up, the sound of insects in the trees, the click of a blade opening, one deep breath, then movement. The monster didn't rush. He never rushed. He watched, then struck. And as I sat there, a terrible thought hit me. What if he was still watching? What if the Monster of Florence never left the crime scene? Back at my motel, I laid out the two files side by side, 1968, 1974, and the line connecting them was stronger than ever. Whoever killed in 74 had done it before, that much was clear. But here's the part they don't teach you in the academy. Sometimes, the closer you get to the truth, the more it rearranges you. You don't just investigate monsters, you carry them. The media didn't help. They branded it the Monster of Florence after the second killing. The name stuck. It gave the killer identity, myth, a presence in people's minds, and that's when things began to spiral. Locals whispered theories that it was a satanic cult, that it was a jealous priest, that it was a secret society using the killings as cover for ritual. I thought they were just rumors, until I found a strange line in a private police memo. Symbolic staging may indicate knowledge of esoteric rites. Further profiling recommended. Esoteric rites. The police never released that detail to the public. I didn't sleep much after that. By now, you're probably asking the same question I did. Why wasn't this solved? The answer is painful, but simple. Italy in the 70s wasn't prepared for a predator like this. Jurisdictions didn't share notes. Forensics was a mess. And worse, there were people in power who didn't want this solved, because to solve it would be to unravel everything. The court system, the police, the very idea that monsters wear masks we can't always remove. Next, I'll take you to the 1980 murders, the double killing that broke the case open, and yet buried it deeper. Because when you learn what happened there, you'll understand how far the monster's shadow reached, and why I still check over my shoulder, even when I know I'm alone. You'd think the third time would be when the pattern became undeniable, when the murders reached a point where even the most skeptical officer would stop calling it coincidence. But in Italy, back in 1981, the truth didn't move in straight lines. It twisted, it whispered, and sometimes it wrote back. The year before 1980, the monster had struck again. Carmela Denuccio and Giovanni Foggi, young, engaged, the kind of couple you'd expect to see on a postcard from Tuscany. They parked near Scandicci, just outside Florence. Another lover's lane, another night, another slaughter. The press barely had time to print the headlines before another couple, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, were found dead in almost identical circumstances. This time, the woman had been mutilated even more savagely. There was no hesitation now, no restraint. The monster had grown confident, or worse, comfortable. I saw the scene photos. God help me, I wish I hadn't. The human body isn't meant to be opened like that. It looked surgical, but also intimate. The knife wounds weren't random, they were precise, intentional. As if the killer wasn't just trying to kill, but to erase. That's when the letters started. Unmarked envelopes, no fingerprints, no DNA, sent to journalists, police, judges, even priests. Some typed, some handwritten, all unsigned. And every single one of them, new details that hadn't been made public. Victim positions, angles of entry, phrases from autopsy reports that had never left closed doors. One letter in particular made my skin crawl. It was sent to La Nazione, the Florentine newspaper, just 2 weeks after the 1981 killings. A single line, typed on an old Olivetti lettera 32. Beauty is only real when it bleeds. I showed that line to a retired profiler, an American who worked on the Zodiac case in San Francisco. He didn't even flinch, he just nodded. It's a signature. He wants to be heard now. That assumption, that comfort of masculinity. But I wasn't sure anymore. What if it wasn't just one man? What if the monster was a collective, an ideology masquerading as a killer? I met a man in Florence, someone who claimed to have seen one of the letters before the police ever acknowledged them. He called himself only Lupo. He wore sunglasses indoors and spoke like a man who'd forgotten how to sleep. He told me, the letters are real, but they weren't sent from Florence. Where then? I asked. He smiled, thin and bitter. Perugia. Same postmark, same typewriter, every time. That's when something shifted in my investigation. I wasn't chasing a ghost anymore. I was chasing someone who wanted to be found, just not by the police. You see, these weren't just letters. They were performances, confessions wrapped in riddles. One even included a drawing, childlike, crude, of a man holding a knife and standing over a sleeping couple in a car. The caption beneath read, "The Night Watchman." I scanned that image into my archive. I stared at it for hours. The style reminded me of something I couldn't place until I came across an obscure exhibit catalog from 1970. Local outsider artist, same lines, same shapes, same ink pressure, same fractured paranoia. I cross-referenced the artist's name with local psychiatric admissions from the time. One match, a patient discharged 6 months before the first known monster killing. I submitted a request to access his medical file. It was denied, twice. On the third attempt, I got a call from someone at the health ministry. No name, no number on the caller ID, just a voice, calm and clear. Some cases are best left unsolved. Click. I've been followed twice since then, once in a rental Fiat, once on foot through the San Lorenzo market. Both times, I couldn't get a good look, but I knew. Someone was trying to warn me off. That's when I realized the letters weren't sent to taunt, they were bait. The monster, whoever, whatever he is, wanted to draw in those who looked too closely, to feed the myth, to blur the lines between truth and story, until even investigators became part of the performance. One judge who worked the case in the mid-80s received a letter with no writing, just a pressed flower, a white camellia. It was the same flower found clutched in the hand of a girl murdered years earlier in a completely different region. That case had never been linked to the monster until that letter. I'm telling you, this wasn't random. This was a spider web. The Monster of Florence wasn't just stalking couples in cars. He was worming into the minds of those chasing him, making them question their own threads of logic. I found out later that at least 2 journalists who had received letters had suffered breakdowns. One disappeared entirely, last seen boarding a train to Palermo. Another was hospitalized after trying to burn all her research, screaming that he's inside the pages. When I tell you this case is cursed, I don't mean it lightly. There's something parasitic about it. The more you know, the more it knows you. I still get emails, anonymous, some with attachments, audio files of whispers. One was just a loop of a man's voice saying, "I was there, I was there, I was there." It wasn't digital distortion, it was breath, wet, real, human. I played it for a sound engineer. He cleaned it up, enhanced it. When he gave it back, he handed me the file on a USB. No explanation. He didn't charge me, just said, "Don't contact me again." So I keep the USB in a locked drawer now, next to the copy of that drawing. And the pressed camellia I got in the mail last winter. No return address. There's more. Oh, there's so much more. But next we go to the suspects. The ones whose names were dragged through the Italian press, whose homes were searched, whose lives were shredded, because someone had to pay for the monster's sins, even if they weren't guilty. Because in Florence, sometimes the scapegoats scream loud enough to drown out the monster behind them. They say justice is blind. In Florence, she wasn't just blind. She was gagged, hooded, and handed a knife. After the 1981 killings, public pressure hit a boiling point. The people wanted answers. Politicians wanted results. The media wanted blood. So the police did what they've done for centuries when the monster in the shadows evades them. They turned toward the light and chose easy targets. The first was a man named Enzo Spalletti, a parking lot attendant, small-time criminal, peeping Tom by reputation, the kind of guy you'd pass on the street and instinctively pull your coat tighter around you. He was arrested in May of 1981, shortly after the murder of Carmela D'Annunzio and Giovanni Foggi. The reason? He had told a coworker about the murder before it hit the morning news. Guilty? No, just early. You see, Spalletti worked nights. He had passed by the scene, saw flashing lights in the distance, maybe overheard a few words, maybe filled in the blanks, but that was enough. The papers ran with it. Monster caught, and just like that, Spalletti became a scapegoat. I read the transcripts. They interrogated him for hours. He denied everything. He asked for a lawyer. They refused. Then they planted stories in the press about him being a pervert, a loner, a voyeur. The irony, while Spalletti was sitting in a cell, the monster struck again. That should have cleared him. It didn't. You want to know why? Because it was never about the truth. It was about closing the file. Next came the voodoo doctor, Pietro Pacciani. If you've heard that name before, it's because his trial became a media circus in the 1990s. But his story begins earlier. In the 1950s, Pacciani was convicted of murdering a man who'd slept with his girlfriend, brutally, overkill. He went to prison, served his time, came out a strange, brooding figure, a farmer, heavy-set, paranoid, with a collection of hunting knives and an unhealthy fixation on control. He was the perfect monster. In 1993, police arrested him and accused him of being the Monster of Florence. They claimed he kept trophies, that he knew details only the killer would know. They pointed to his violent past, his abuse of his own daughters, his erratic behavior. They painted a picture so vivid, so grotesque, that the public didn't just believe it, they needed to believe it. I sat through hours of archived courtroom footage. Pacciani looked like the kind of man who'd hurt people. but not like the monster. There was no precision in his past crimes, no ritual, no silence. He was messy, loud, desperate, a different breed of predator. But the prosecution pressed on. They introduced a new theory, the Compagnia di Merende, the snack friends, a supposed satanic cult of elderly peasants who stalked and killed lovers to feed some twisted fantasy. Pacchiani was the ringleader. His friends, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, were his accomplices. You heard that right. The Monster of Florence, according to Italian justice, was a geriatric murder triangle with a taste for sadism and sandwiches. I don't laugh at it, because it worked. The public ate it up. The police got their closure. Pacchiani was convicted, then overturned, then retried, then dead. Yes, dead. 1998, before his new trial began. Found in his bathroom. Natural causes, they said. But the autopsy was inconclusive. I spoke with someone who examined the body, a forensic pathologist who no longer lives in Italy. She told me, under condition of anonymity, there were bruises on his throat, faint but fresh. Strangled? She nodded. Not enough to kill, just enough to warn. I believe Pacchiani knew something. Maybe he wasn't the monster, but maybe he knew who was. Maybe he had seen something, heard something. Maybe he got too close. And then he was gone. The scapegoats kept piling up. Lotti confessed, then recanted, then confessed again. His story changed every time. Sometimes he was at the scene, sometimes he wasn't. Sometimes there were satanic symbols, sometimes just shadows. He said what they wanted him to say. And when he got confused, they filled in the blanks. His confession became the foundation for the prosecution's story. But if you read it, really read it, you can see the holes, the contradictions, the impossibilities. And yet, justice moved forward. It's what systems do when they're too embarrassed to admit they've been hunting the wrong man for 30 years. I tried speaking with one of the surviving relatives of Mario Vanni. She declined, politely. But at the end of our call, she said something in a low voice, almost a whisper. "You're not safe if you keep asking these questions." I asked, "Why?" She just said, "Because the monster was never caught, only caged inside men too poor to fight back." That line stuck with me, because she was right. The monster had outlived his scapegoats. He had become something bigger, an institution, a shadow behind the badge, behind the bench, behind the bylines of the newspapers. Florence didn't want a killer. It needed a symbol, someone to hang the blame on, so the tourists could keep sipping espresso and the politicians could sleep soundly. But I'm not here for symbols. I'm here for blood, for truth, for the moments that don't make it into the court record, the things whispered after the lights go out. And in the next section, I'll take you to the theories they don't publish, the dark rooms, the hidden tapes, the books that were never meant to be read. Because the Monster of Florence didn't just leave bodies, he left breadcrumbs, and I've been following them deeper than I ever meant to go. There's a room in the Palazzo di Giustizia in Florence where light doesn't reach, a basement archive. Windowless, fluorescent lights that buzz like insects in a jar. I had to sign 3 forms just to enter. No phones, no photos, just me, a pencil, and the shadows of history pressing in from every direction. That's where I found them, the files. Not the ones you find in newspaper clippings or open court transcripts. Not the ones translated into English for bored true crime readers on Reddit. No, these were the sealed ones. The ones that came with warnings, scrawled in red pencil across the top folder. Non consultabile senza autorizzazione speciale. Not to be viewed without special authorization. I shouldn't have been able to open them, but someone wanted me to. A small white envelope had arrived at my hotel the night before. No stamp, no name. Inside was a visitor pass with my name printed in perfect serif, a key code, and a note that said, "Start with P-Zone, top shelf, folder 6. I followed the instructions like someone walking barefoot across ice. Folder 6 was heavier than the rest. Inside were photographs, not of the crime scenes. I'd seen enough of those. These were different. Surveillance shots, hidden camera angles, men gathered around a fire in the woods, a naked mannequin placed in the center, candles, symbols etched in dirt. The date, April 17th, 1984. The location, Monte Morello. The caption, suspected ritual gathering. I flipped to the next page, a typed report, classified. It listed known associates of Pietro Pacciani and his so-called snack friends. But the strange part, most names were redacted. Thick black ink, except for one, Francesco Calamandre. A pharmacist, respectable, community figure, never charged, but mentioned repeatedly in connection to esoteric gatherings and symbolic materials. Why was he never arrested? The answer came 6 pages later, tucked behind a note stamped with the emblem of the Carabinieri. Subject holds protected status, not to be disturbed. I read that line again and again. Protected status. By whom? That night, I met with a retired detective who had been pulled from the monster case in '89. He wore a beige coat that looked like it had absorbed the smell of old espresso and failure. When I told him what I found, he didn't blink. He just said, there were files we weren't allowed to open. Orders from higher up, even from Rome. He leaned closer and whispered, this case, it wasn't just murder, it was containment. He meant it literally. There were rumors, whispers even among the police, that the monster's crimes had ties to an underground group, a cult. Not in the Hollywood sense, with robes and chants. No, something quieter, intellectual, ritualistic. Men with education, power, and an interest in symbolic violence. I asked him why no one ever followed the lead. He laughed, bitter and soft. Because when you pull that thread, it doesn't stop. Back in the archives, I found a reference to a book, handwritten in the margin of a witness statement. Just one line. See Il Mostro e l'Occhio, Chapter 14, The Monster and the Eye. It took me a week to find a copy, self-published in 1990. Banned from sale the same year, I finally tracked it down through a former university librarian who kept banned titles for research purposes. Chapter 14 was about the concept of the ritual eye, the belief that violence, if done in a specific symbolic manner, opens a metaphysical gate between experience and transcendence. The author, himself a former anthropology professor, claimed that the monster's killings followed a sacred geometry. Yes, geometry. He mapped the coordinates of each crime scene and placed them over an ancient Etruscan star pattern. It formed a rough pentacle over the Tuscan hills, a perfect alignment. Coincidence? He didn't think so. Neither did I, after what happened next. That same night, my hotel room was entered. Nothing was taken, not visibly, but the folder I had copied pages from moved, not stolen, shifted, like someone had checked what I knew and decided to let me keep knowing. That was the true message. We see you. Since then, I've received 5 anonymous emails, all with the same attachment, a scanned page from a journal, written in tight cursive, the same hand each time, descriptions of the crimes, but not as witness accounts, as observations, like field notes. The woman screamed too soon. It broke the symmetry. Must be better next time. I don't know if they're real. I don't know if I want them to be, but I saved them all, labeled them, Forbidden files. I keep thinking of that old phrase, if you stare into the abyss, but no one ever tells you that the abyss writes back. Next, I'll take you into the night of 1985. The last known murder, the one that changed everything, the one that for some reason ended it all, and maybe gave the monster exactly what he wanted. It was the kind of summer night Florence is known for, warm, quiet, deceptively gentle. You could smell ripening grapes from the hills, the hush of cicadas, the hum of distance, but somewhere near Vecchio, just past the olive groves, just beyond the line where tourists stop and secrets begin, the Monster of Florence made his final move. September 7th, 1985. Jean-Michel Krivitschvili and Nadine Moria, a French couple on vacation. They'd rented a small tent in the woods near Scopetti, a cheap escape. They weren't parked in a car like the previous victims. They were camping, secluded, wrapped in canvas and trust. And that change, that single difference, may have been their doom. I've stood in that clearing. The trees seem taller than they should be. Everything feels damp, still. Time doesn't move there, it presses in. The crime scene reports paint a picture more brutal than the others. Jean-Michel was attacked outside the tent, likely while urinating. He was stabbed repeatedly, viciously. But Nadine bore the ritual. The tent was slashed open. She was dragged out. Her body was mutilated post-mortem, following the same pattern established in the previous killings. Precise incisions, removal of sexual organs. But there was something new this time, something worse. A branch had been inserted, again, but this time it had been positioned almost like punctuation. I hate that word in this context, but it fits. Because this kill didn't just feel like another chapter, it felt like a final line. I interviewed the first responder, now in his 70s, hands that tremble even when they're still. He told me something I haven't read in any official file. He said, the ground around her, it wasn't just trampled, it was cleared, like someone wanted a stage. The stage, the show, the finale. But here's what truly haunts me. A week before the murder, the French couple had gone to the Florence police station. They reported a man watching them. A local said he'd been seen lurking near their tent multiple times. The report was filed and forgotten. No patrol followed up, no warning issued, no protection offered. Just another foreign couple blending into the Italian countryside until they became another set of names in the monster's legacy. I tracked down their daughter. She's in her 40s now, living in Lyon. She didn't want to speak at first, but then she asked me, softly, why didn't anyone stop him? They told the police. They asked for help. Why? I had no answer, just the truth. Florence didn't want to see what was in front of it. Or maybe it saw too much. Because here's where things get strange. After 1985, the killings stopped completely. No more couples, no more mutilations, no more monster. Theories flooded in. He died. He was arrested for another crime. He fled the country. He was silenced. He completed the ritual. That last one, that's the one I've been circling ever since. Because if the monster was following a pattern, and I believe he was, then maybe this final kill was the culmination, the end of a cycle, a sacrifice even. I came across a note in one of the forbidden files, a reference to an Etruscan burial rite, a ritual of 7. 7 bodies, 7 offerings, 7 nights. Only then would the curse be lifted. 7 couples were murdered, 14 people, all within a 13-year span. The killings map into a shape, a crescent that curves around the city of Florence like a scythe. A French investigator I spoke with called it the smile of the monster. He believed the killer had completed a symbolic death ritual, a blood mandala of sorts, one that could only be understood through ancient esoteric codes. And then, silence. No more letters, no more murders. But that's not the same as closure. Because when a monster stops killing, it doesn't mean he's gone. It means he's changed. Maybe he was watching all along, watching the panic, the arrests, the trials, the scapegoats, and laughing. Because if there's one thing this killer knew how to do, it was to vanish and leave the rest of us to fight over the wreckage. I walked that final site again, alone, just me and the trees and the whispers of a crime that has never stopped echoing. I sat near where Nadine was found. The grass still doesn't grow quite right there. The air feels thinner, and then I saw it. A small wooden carving nailed into a tree, a crude eye, not old, not weathered, fresh, recently placed. I didn't touch it, didn't take a photo. Some things are meant to be left as warnings. In the next section, I'll show you the aftershock, how the monster's legacy rewrote justice, journalism, and the very identity of a city trying to forget while never truly letting go. Because Florence wasn't just the scene of the crimes, it became the accomplice. I used to think cities couldn't lie, that cobblestones didn't keep secrets, that architecture couldn't bleed. But Florence changed my mind. It's a place of duality, Renaissance beauty masking medieval rot, postcard perfection hiding whispered violence, and at the heart of it, a quiet complicity so deep, you begin to wonder if the whole city made a deal with the monster long ago. You feel it walking through the streets. It's not just history that clings to the buildings. It's something older, something more patient. Every church shadow, every alley corner, every rusted gate, it watches you. I started digging into the civic records, municipal files, zoning permits, police department communications from the 70s and 80s. What I found wasn't just negligence. It was erosion, a slow decay of accountability. Cases were opened, closed, reopened, shuffled, lost. Officers transferred suddenly. Judges recused without reason. Files misplaced. Then there were the accidents. 2 officers involved in the early investigations died within a year of each other. One in a supposed hit and run, the other suicide. Except the note was typed, unsigned, and curiously emotionless. A coroner flagged inconsistencies in the trajectory of the bullet wound. The report was sealed. I requested access. Denied. You start to see it, don't you? The invisible hand. The pressure behind the curtain. A force not just hiding the monster, but protecting him. But why? That question kept me awake. And then I met Dee. She wouldn't give me her real name. She was in her 80s now, lived in a modest apartment near Santa Cruz. She had once worked in the Florence court system as a file clerk. When I asked about the monster case, she shook her head, then made a sign of the cross. He was never meant to be caught, she said. I pressed her, gently. She stared out the window for a long time before speaking again. There were meetings, behind doors, men in suits who didn't belong to the police. They came with briefcases. They left with files. Which files? I asked. The ones with blood on them. She meant that metaphorically, or so I thought. But then she handed me an envelope. Inside, a torn photocopy, a list of names, judges, businessmen, artists, one former politician. All had ties to Florence's cultural elite. And beside 3 of those names, in shaky handwriting, eyes at crime scene. I recognized 2 names from the Pacciani case, not as suspects, as witnesses who recanted, and were never seen in court again. That's when it hit me. Florence didn't just fail to catch the monster, it absorbed him. Institutionally, culturally, silently, he became a part of the landscape. Look at the response timeline to the 1981 murder. It took police over 12 hours to process the scene properly. Evidence wasn't logged until the next day. A footprint, likely from the killer, was trampled by a reporter. No one stopped him. No perimeter, no urgency. But when two journalists began publishing articles suggesting police incompetence, they were arrested, charged with defamation. One of them, a man named Luca Rinaldi, later published a memoir titled La Città Chica, The Blind City. It was pulled from shelves a week after release. The publisher's office was mysteriously firebombed. No injuries, no suspects. I found a single copy in a used bookstore in Bologna. Inside, in chapter 12, was a line I can't stop thinking about. The monster didn't just kill people. He taught the city to fear the truth. And he did. Ask any local now about Il Mostro. Most will shrug, call it ancient history. Tour guides avoid the topic. It's as if the city decided, collectively, to forget, to bury it beneath paintings, cathedrals, and gelato. But the cracks remain. Florence's new Justice Center was built in 2000, huge, modern, full of glass and steel, a symbol of progress. But there's a rumor whispered among the janitorial staff. That one office, sealed off for renovations during construction, was found to contain a box. Inside the box, a photograph, the tent and scopity, and written on the back, in red ink, "No one forgets, they just lie better." I tried to verify that story. No one would go on record, but one guard, after a few drinks, told me, "We all knew the monster was bigger than one man, but if you admit that, Florence becomes a crime scene." He was right. The buildings become accomplices, the streets, cover-ups, the monuments, testimonies carved in silence. It's why I no longer see Florence the way tourists do. They see Botticelli. I see redacted police reports. They see frescoes. I see crime scene chalk. They take selfies with statues. I see ghosts. In the next section, I'll bring you the aftermath, the new leads, the modern attempts to solve this case, the DNA tests, the digital forensics, the podcast theories and amateur sleuths, and how all of it leads nowhere. Because the Monster of Florence was never meant to be caught, he was meant to last. By the time forensics caught up with the Monster of Florence, he had already become something else entirely. Not a man, not even a case, a myth wrapped in paper, a crime scene with no fingerprints, a riddle that answered you by changing the question. But science doesn't believe in myths. So, in 2002, they exhumed the bodies. Literally, victims' graves were reopened, bones tested, clothing retested, evidence re-examined with tools that didn't exist in the 1980s. They scraped under fingernails, vacuumed fibers, extracted samples from weapons no one ever found. The goal was simple: use modern DNA technology to close a case that had been rotting for decades. It didn't go well. I visited the crime lab in Perugia, where much of the retesting took place. Sterile, cold, clean, the opposite of everything the monster was. The lead technician was polite, professional. He offered me espresso. I declined. My hands were already shaking. He pulled out a box of files, each one marked with the name of a victim, and then he said, "We thought we'd get answers. Instead, we got silence. No foreign DNA. No clear matches. No conclusive traces linking anyone. Not Spalletti, not Pacciani, not Vanni or Lotti, or any of the other scapegoats, to the bodies or the weapons." But here's where it gets darker. There was DNA, just not human. On several of the victims' clothing, particularly the female victims, Traces of animal hair were discovered. Wild boar, dog. One sample was inconclusive, possibly fox or wolf. At first, they assumed contamination, but then it appeared again and again, in different years, different locations. Same hair type, same degraded structure. That's when the new theory formed. The monster wasn't alone. He had help. Someone, or something, was moving through the woods with him. A trained animal? A hunting dog? Or maybe someone bringing trophies from one scene to the next, deliberately cross-contaminating the evidence to blur the trail. I've spoken to 3 forensics experts. All agreed it's not typical and not accidental. One of them even said it's like he wanted to leave behind clues, but not to himself, to confusion. But the most chilling discovery came in 2004. An anonymous tip led police to a farmhouse near Vecchio. Inside, journals, ropes, knives, newspaper clippings, and an old Polaroid of a couple, possibly French, naked, asleep in a tent. The photo was never published. It was taken before the murders. That house belonged to an elderly recluse who died in 1996. Never a suspect, no children, no family, and no link to the official investigation. They ran DNA swabs from items inside. They found partial male DNA on one of the knives. Partial, not enough to match to anyone in the system, but enough to create a profile. So they tried something new. They ran a familial match scan across the Italian DNA database and found something, a close match, not a suspect, a child, a 14-year-old boy from Sardinia whose father was unknown. Mother had died of illness. The state raised him. The implications? The monster may have had a child, or at least someone with matching genes was still alive. But before they could track it further, the case was shut down, quietly. The DNA file was locked behind bureaucratic red tape. Funding was cut. The lab technician I interviewed was reassigned. "We got too close," he said. I asked, "To what?" He just looked at me and whispered, "To someone still alive." That's the horror of it. The monster may be gone, but his legacy is breathing. The investigators turned to international agencies, Interpol, Europol. They submitted files, requested cross-border records. Most requests were denied. Some were returned blank. One came back with a single sentence in French. Les monstres dorment rarement seuls. Monsters rarely sleep alone. Since then, a dozen podcasts have taken up the case. Reddit forums, YouTube documentaries, each promising a new theory, a new suspect, a new lead, but it always ends the same way. DNA that doesn't match, suspects who vanish, files that disappear, like the monster is still one step ahead, still watching, still preparing. I started to feel it too, the sense that I wasn't alone. Emails from addresses that didn't exist, calls from numbers that disconnect when I answer. Once, someone slid a note under my hotel door in Florence. Just 4 words. Don't dig too deep. But I already had. And what I'd uncovered wasn't just the story of a killer. It was the story of a system designed to protect something ancient, ugly, and alive. In the next section, I'll bring you into the final layer, the dark tourism, the obsession, the people who worship the monster now like he's a god of fear. Because even in silence, he speaks, and some are still listening. You think obsession has a shelf life, that eventually, even horror fades, becomes trivia, something between an urban legend and a Wikipedia page. But in Florence, the monster never faded. He evolved. He found followers. Not copycats, not criminals, devotees. It started as a whisper, online mostly, niche forums, encrypted message boards, threads with titles like Il Mostro knew the geometry or Blood opens the gate. I dismissed it at first, just the usual internet rot, keyboard ghouls looking for an identity. Then I found the chapel. It was deep in the hills near Monte Spertoli, a forgotten ruin. Cracked walls, a roof barely holding. Locals say it had been abandoned since World War II. No history of anything religious there for decades, but someone had been using it. I stepped inside and instantly knew I'd gone too far. The smell of wax and damp stone, faded chalk sigils drawn on the floor, animal bones arranged in concentric circles, and at the center, tacked to the altar with a hunting knife, was a photograph of Nadine Moreau. Not the crime scene photo, a candid one, her smiling in a sundress, holding a glass of wine, and behind her, blurred but unmistakable, a man's figure watching. There was no dust on the photo, no mildew. Whoever had placed it had done so recently. I took nothing, touched nothing, but I memorized the symbols, snapped photos once I was outside. That night, I sent them to a professor of ancient symbology in Rome. She replied with one line, "You've walked into a door that should have stayed closed." It wasn't just fans of true crime, it was something else. People drawn not to the horror of the killings, but to their rhythm, their pattern. People who saw the monster not as a man, but as a force, a shadow that moved with meaning. They called him Lochio, the Eye. Some believed each murder was a key, unlocking a higher perception of death. Others believed the monster had transcended, become incorporeal, like an idea that lives in the spaces between stories. I joined one of their encrypted chat groups, using an alias. They spoke in riddles, quoted from trial documents, autopsy reports, even poetry written by Pietro Pacciani in prison. One message stood out: we don't kill, we remember, so that the cycle stays hungry. They weren't planning murders, they were preserving mythology. They were treating the Monster of Florence like scripture. Another member posted coordinates. I checked them. A spot in the Mugello woods, not far from the site of the 1984 killings. I went there at dawn. At the base of a tree, half buried in earth, was a sealed glass jar. Inside, a cassette tape, wrapped in a child's drawing of two figures in a tent, one holding a knife, the other sleeping. I had the tape digitized by an old technician in Milan. He didn't ask questions. The audio, breathing, nothing else. Just slow, deep, calm breathing for 43 minutes. Then a whisper, "You're too late. We've already inherited him." That same night, someone emailed me a photo. Black and white, grainy, a candlelit room. 6 people standing in a circle, all wearing plain masks. No features, no mouths, just empty eye holes. The subject line read, "You saw the chapel, this is where it ends." There was no body in the photo, no violence. But somehow, it felt worse than the crime scenes. These weren't killers, they were keepers. And Florence let them bloom. I started noticing signs around the city, stickers, chalk marks near alleyways, a triangle with an eye inside, drawn beneath park benches and under bridges, harmless on their own, but too consistent to be coincidence. One shopkeeper near San Frediano told me, quietly, "We all know what the symbol means. We just don't say it. You say it, you invite it." I asked, "Invite what?" She only said, "The eye doesn't blink." I couldn't sleep that night. Every knock on the wall, every gust of wind, I thought I saw him. Not the monster, not the man, the idea. Because that's what this case has become. Not a question of who, but what. What does it mean when horror becomes holy, when ritual becomes remembrance? They didn't want justice, they wanted presence, and the monster gave them that, in silence, in mystery, in a trail of blood that ended without resolution, so that it could be walked again, and I was walking it. By the next morning, the tape had vanished from my desk. No break-in, nothing taken, just gone. In its place, a small object, a pressed white camellia, no note, no explanation, just the same flower left at the crime scene decades ago. I knew then I wasn't investigating anymore. I was being observed. In the next section, I'll take you to the end of this journey, the conspiracy no one dared name, the truth that buried itself, and the theory that explains everything while answering nothing. Because in Florence, monsters don't die, they wait. The truth isn't buried under paper, it's buried under soil. That's the thought I kept coming back to. After all the reports, the tapes, the testimonies, the masks, the maps, the sealed files, after all of it, I ended up where it began, among the olive trees, where the first couple was found, and maybe where the monster was born. The grass had regrown, the trees had thickened, but if you looked hard enough, you could still see it. The depression in the ground where the car had once parked, the old stone wall that had crumbled, now overgrown with vines. The birds didn't sing there. I brought the files with me, all of them, notebooks, photos, a copy of the autopsy sketches, pages marked with names, real and redacted. I laid them out on the hood of my rental car and looked at them one more time, and I saw it. Not evidence, not logic, a shape, the pattern. Each killing, each scene was arranged, not just geographically, but narratively, like a spiral tightening inward, a story with no author, but too much intention to be random. What if the monster didn't choose victims? What if he chose chapters, the mutilations, the staging, the pauses between killings? Even the reappearance of the white camellia, they weren't signs of disorder. They were structure, ritual, design, a manuscript in flesh. And if that was true, then this place, this grove, was the preface. I dug that day, not with hope, with inevitability. About a foot down, beneath the soil still damp from morning rain, I hit something that wasn't dirt, wood, rotting, a box, not large, maybe the size of a shoebox. I hesitated. I remember how still the air went. Even the breeze stopped moving. I reached in, heart hammering. Inside, a roll of undeveloped film, a leather-bound notebook, brittle and faded, a small bone, human, female, and beneath all of that, a page, typed, yellowed, stained. You followed well, but you asked the wrong question. It was never about who, it was about why. Pain is the only truth that can't lie. Now that you've seen it, will you leave it buried again? There was no signature, just a symbol at the bottom, a single eye, hand-drawn. I didn't take the bone. I left it in the box. I put the notebook back too. Just took the film and the page, and I filled the hole, carefully, respectfully, because some things don't want to be found. That night, I had the film developed in a private lab near Bologna. The technician said most of it was ruined, exposed to light, moisture, time. But one image came through, black and white, a couple in the distance, obscured, taken from behind foliage, a voyeur's gaze, and behind them, barely visible, in the tree line, a figure, tall, still, not hiding, just waiting. I don't know who he was. Maybe no one, maybe the monster. Or maybe the monster is the thing that made that photo matter. Because here's the truth I've come to after everything. The Monster of Florence may not have been a man. He may not have even been a group. The monster might be the silence between facts, the space between bodies, the city's willingness to forget, the system's hunger to blame, the people who looked away, the ones who watched too closely, the victims, the killers, the investigators. The monster is Florence itself, or rather, the version of Florence that never let the truth breathe. The version that still walks quietly through the olive trees at night, sharpening the blade, not for the next victim, but for the next myth. And as I close this chapter, I realize you never solve a case like this. You inherit it. I came to Florence chasing a killer. What I found was a mirror. Every document, every photograph, every mutilated body, each one was a reflection of something deeper, not just in the man who held the knife, but in the city that led him, in the justice system that preferred convenience over truth, in the journalists who got too close and were buried under silence, in the cultists who turned horror into holiness, in me for digging too deep, and maybe in you for listening this far. They called him Il Mostro di Firenze. But the more I followed the trail, the more I realized the monster didn't just walk among us. He was us. The fear, the obsession, the need to know, the willingness to believe anything except that the truth might be worse than the mystery. Maybe it was one man, maybe it was many. Maybe it was a ritual, or a warning, or a story that got out of hand. But the reason he was never caught, the reason no DNA matched, no fingerprints stuck, no theory held, wasn't just incompetence. It was protection by the very institutions meant to expose him. They buried evidence, redirected suspicion, arrested scapegoats, invented monsters to protect the real one. And somewhere beneath those olive trees, the deal still holds. So what's left? A box of sealed files, a photo of a shadow in the woods, a child who shares DNA with no father, a pressed flower in a drawer I never open, and the knowledge that the Monster of Florence may never have been meant to be solved. Because what do you do when the evil isn't a man hiding in the trees, but a city pretending the trees were never stained in the first place? You leave the case open, not for justice, but as a warning. Because somewhere out there, someone still remembers the pattern, still walks the woods, still believes the monster wasn't a man, he was an idea, and ideas don't die. They wait for the next follower, the next myth, the next story that ends exactly the way this one does, with no answers, and one more whisper in the dark.